The gun was already pressed to Reuben Keating's temple when Rosa Redmond made the decision that would either save them both or destroy everything she had spent 3 months carefully, painstakingly, and desperately building. She did not scream. She did not faint. She stood in the center of the dusty main street of Caldwell, Kansas, on a scorching afternoon in August of 1882, with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, and she looked directly into the eyes of the man holding the weapon, and said, in a voice that did not waver even slightly, "Pull that trigger, Chester Finch, and I will personally make sure your wife knows every single secret you have been keeping since you rode into this town." The silence that followed was the longest Rosa had ever lived through. Reuben Keating, United States Marshal, stood with his hands raised slightly, his badge catching the brutal afternoon sun, a trickle of sweat running from beneath his hat down the side of his jaw. He did not look afraid. He looked impossibly like he was calculating something, his dark eyes moving in the smallest increments, reading the street, reading Rosa, reading Chester Finch's trembling trigger finger with the cold precision of a man who had survived situations like this before, and intended to survive this one too. But Rosa had seen something he had not. She had seen Chester Finch's eyes flicker the moment she mentioned his wife. She had seen the betrayal written in his expression, not betrayal toward Reuben, but the deeper, more corrosive kind, the betrayal of a man who has been secretly terrified for years that the one person who still loved him might finally learn the truth. "You would not dare," Chester said, but his voice cracked on the second word. "Try me," Rosa said simply, and the gun came down. What followed was a controlled chaos of shouts and running boots and Reuben moving with the kind of decisive, mechanical efficiency that made the whole thing look almost routine. Chester was on the ground and in irons within 40 seconds. The deputy who had been hiding behind the barber pole across the street finally came out from his cover looking thoroughly embarrassed. The crowd that had gathered on the boardwalks on either side of the street let out a collective exhale that sounded like wind moving through a wheat field. But Rosa barely registered any of it, because Reuben Keating had turned to look at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, not in 3 months of careful, guarded, professionally correct interaction. And that expression was not gratitude, not professional acknowledgement, not the quiet nod of one capable person recognizing another. It was something far more dangerous than any of that. It was awe. And standing there in the middle of Caldwell's Main Street, with dust settling around her boots and her heart still going like a runaway horse, Rosa Redmond thought about the first time she had ever seen Reuben Keating's face, and how it had all truly begun not on this street in the aftermath of violence, but on a train platform 3 months ago on a cold May morning, when she had been entirely alone and entirely terrified, and the last thing she had expected in the world was for a federal marshal to pick up her trunk. It had been the 12th of May, 1882, a Thursday, and Rosa Redmond had arrived at the Caldwell train station with one large trunk, one small leather satchel, $37 in saved wages, 2 letters of recommendation from her former employer in St. Louis, a plan that was already partially unraveling, and a very deep, very carefully maintained sense of purpose that she was using to hold herself together from the inside out. She was 26 years old. She had spent the last 4 years working as a seamstress, an alterations specialist for a dress shop in St. Louis, which had been respectable employment and occasionally interesting work, and utterly, completely wrong for her in every way that mattered. She had grown up in Independence, Missouri, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had died when Rosa was 14, and she had been educated well enough and stubborn enough and quietly brave enough to eventually answer an advertisement in a St. Louis newspaper placed by a woman named Helen Cartwright, who was opening a millinery and dress shop in Caldwell, Kansas, and who needed a skilled seamstress with good references and the willingness to relocate. The willingness to relocate. Rosa had more than that. She had a desperate, bone-deep need to relocate, to leave the city and its familiar weight behind, to go somewhere that did not remind her every single day of the engagement she had ended 2 years ago, and the man she had ended it with. A man named Gerald Voss, who had turned out to have a dark past and a set of hidden motives that had taken her far too long to recognize and far too much emotional damage to finally acknowledge. She did not like to think about Gerald Voss. She had made herself stop thinking about Gerald Voss. She had built herself back up, brick by careful brick, into a woman who trusted her own judgment and did not need rescuing and could handle whatever came at her with composure and intelligence. And then the train had pulled into Caldwell, and it had been 38 degrees and raining sideways, and Helen Cartwright, who was supposed to meet her, had sent a boy instead with a note explaining that she had been delayed by a supplier and would Rosa please make her way to the shop on Commerce Street, which was only 2 blocks from the station, and she was terribly sorry for the inconvenience. 2 blocks in sideways rain with a trunk that weighed approximately as much as a small pony. Rosa had stood on that platform reading the note a second time, then a third time, and had then very composedly tucked it into her satchel and turned to find a porter, of which there were apparently none at this particular moment, and had instead found herself looking at the broadest set of shoulders she had ever seen in her life, wrapped in a dark canvas duster, with a United States Marshal star pinned to the front of it. He had not been looking at her. He had been looking at a telegram he was reading, his hat tilted against the rain, his expression entirely neutral in the way that suggested the neutrality was habitual rather than circumstantial. He was perhaps 30 or 31, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that looked like it had been assembled specifically to hold a determined expression, and hands that were large and capable-looking, and currently holding a telegraph paper with surprising care. Rosa had looked at him for exactly 2 seconds and then looked away, because she did not look at strangers the way she had just looked at him, and because this was not the time, and because she had $37 and a trunk and a practical mission, and no room in her current architecture for whatever that 2 seconds had just been. She had bent to grip the trunk handle, and had immediately understood that dragging it 2 blocks in this rain was going to be both physically miserable and potentially destructive to the contents, which included her good dress and her second-best dress and her sewing kit and her mother's small silver mirror, and approximately 8 months of carefully assembled professional tools and personal objects. She had straightened up and looked around again for a porter. "Where are you headed?" The voice had come from directly behind her and was a baritone low enough to register in her sternum, and Rosa had turned to find the Marshal standing approximately 3 feet away, the telegram now folded and disappeared into his pocket, his eyes on her with an expression of entirely neutral inquiry. "Commerce Street," she said. "The millinery shop." He had nodded once, and then, without another word, without asking permission, without making any kind of performance of it, he had simply bent down and picked up her trunk. Not offered to pick it up, not asked if she needed help. He had simply picked it up the way you pick up something that needs to be carried, settled it under one arm with an ease that suggested the weight was not a significant concern for him, and had looked at her with that same neutral expression and said, "This way." And Rosa, who had spent 4 years being entirely self-sufficient and was deeply suspicious of unrequested assistance, and had very firm opinions about not depending on anyone she did not know, had found herself picking up her satchel and walking beside him without a single word of protest. She thought about that moment a great deal in the weeks and months that followed. She thought about why she had not protested, not insisted she could manage herself, not done any of the things she would normally have done in that situation. She thought about it and she could not entirely explain it, except to say that there had been something in the way he had done it, not with any expectation of gratitude, not with any sense of performing a service, not with any implication that she was helpless and required assistance, but simply because the trunk was there and needed carrying, and he was going the same direction and it was raining, and it had been the most untheatrical act of simple, practical human decency she had encountered in recent memory. He had walked with her the 2 blocks to Commerce Street, carrying her trunk without apparent effort, making no attempt at small talk, which she appreciated rather than found odd. He had set the trunk down inside the doorway of the millinery shop, touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgment of her thanks, told her his name when she asked it, Reuben Keating, and added that he was the federal marshal assigned to Caldwell and the surrounding territory, and had walked back out into the rain. Rosa had stood in the doorway of the millinery shop watching him go until he turned a corner, and then she had turned around and found Helen Cartwright, who had arrived from the back room, looking at her with an expression of considerable amusement. "You met Reuben Keating," Helen said, not as a question. "He carried my trunk," Rosa said. "He does that," Helen said. "He is the most quietly decent man in this territory, and he will not tell you a single personal thing about himself for approximately 3 months, so don't try to rush it." Rosa had decided she was not going to try to do anything at all, and had then spent the next 3 months involuntarily doing exactly the opposite of that. Caldwell in the spring of 1882 was a complicated, contradictory, living thing of a town. It sat near the Kansas-Oklahoma border and functioned as one of the last major cattle trail towns in the region, with the great cattle drive still pushing through from Texas, bringing trail hands and trouble and money and noise in roughly equal measure. It had a newspaper, 3 churches, 2 hotels, a schoolhouse, a jail with a new lock on the front door, and a population of approximately 900 people who were engaged in the daily project of deciding what kind of town they wanted to be. Rosa threw herself into her work with Helen Cartwright and found, to her considerable satisfaction, that she was genuinely good at the business side of things in addition to the craft. Helen was a warm, practical woman in her early 40s, a widow who had run successful operations in Wichita before Caldwell, and she had a gift for reading people and an equal gift for recognizing when she had found someone worth trusting. She trusted Rosa within 2 weeks. Rosa found the trust was mutual. The shop did well. Caldwell's women, both the ranchers' wives who came in from the surrounding territory and the town women and the occasional more cosmopolitan visitor, were deeply interested in current styles, and Rosa had brought with her a set of fashion plates from a St. Louis magazine and the ability to interpret them for a frontier context, which turned out to be exactly what was needed. She was busy. She was useful. She was sleeping properly for the first time in years. She was also, in the careful, controlled, thoroughly examined privacy of her own thoughts, aware of Reuben Keating in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to categorize as merely professional awareness. He came into the shop twice in that first month, once to ask if Helen could repair a tear in his deputy's good coat before a town meeting, once to let them know there had been an increase in riders through town, and to ask that they keep the shop locked after dark. Both times he had been entirely professional, entirely courteous, and had made no reference whatsoever to the trunk, which Rosa found she was simultaneously relieved by and vaguely disappointed in. She began to notice other things. The way he moved through town with a kind of deliberate awareness, never hurried, never careless, always reading the street the way a reader reads a page, taking in information continuously. The way the town's more difficult residents, the trail hands who drank too much and the gamblers who cheated, and the occasional man who came in looking for the particular kind of trouble that towns like Caldwell attracted, treated him with a wariness that was not quite fear and not quite respect, but somewhere precisely between the two. The way he spoke to the Mexican families who camped on the town's south edge, in their own language, without condescension. The way he helped old Emmett Harris, who ran the hardware store and had a bad leg, move stock off his wagon one afternoon without being asked, with the same exact quality of simple, unreflective helpfulness that he had carried her trunk with. He carried other people's trunks too, she learned. He helped with things that needed doing. He did not make a point of it, and he did not accept particular gratitude for it. It was, as far as Rosa could determine, simply the texture of how he moved through the world, a kind of embedded, habitual decency that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with character. This, she found, was significantly more dangerous to her equanimity than any theatrical romantic gesture could ever have been. She formally met him, in the sense of a real introduction with more than a sentence exchanged, at a town social in early June. The social was held in the church hall and organized by the Women's Improvement Society, of which Helen was a member, and featured a potluck supper and fiddle music, and the specific social energetics of a small western town in which everyone knew everyone and new arrivals were subjects of considerable interest. Rosa was not precisely shy, but she was reserved in new social settings in a way that could read as shyness, and she had positioned herself near the punch bowl with a glass of lemonade and an expression of interested observation when Reuben Keating had appeared beside her with a plate of food and said, without preamble, "Helen tells me you went to school in Independence." "I did," Rosa said. "My father taught there." "I grew up in Lawrence," he said, "about 40 miles east." This was more personal information than she had expected, and she looked at him directly for what felt like the first time, though she had looked at him many times before, and found that up close, without the rain and the urgency of the train platform, he had a face that was harder to read than she had initially thought, not because it was closed exactly, but because the expressions that moved across it were subtle, fine-grained things that required actual attention to catch. "What brought you to Caldwell?" she asked. "The work," he said, and then, after a pause that she was already learning to recognize as the gap he left for more specific honesty, "and the particular kind of work. This territory is at a hinge point right now. It matters what happens here. I wanted to be somewhere that mattered." Rosa looked at him for a moment. "That is a more forthcoming answer than I expected," she said. Something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. "Most people don't ask the second question," he said. She wanted to ask the third question immediately, and the fourth, and approximately 11 others, and she made herself sip her lemonade calmly and say, "I came because Helen needed a seamstress and I needed a change." "Did you find what you needed?" It was a direct question, and she gave him a direct answer. "I think I'm finding it," she said. "I won't know for certain for a while yet." He nodded, as though this was a completely satisfying and expected response, and they stood together for a while in a silence that was, remarkably, entirely comfortable, watching the fiddle players tune up and the children chase each other between the tables and the town's social architecture arrange and rearrange itself around them. He asked her to dance twice that evening. She accepted both times. He was a careful dancer, precise rather than showy, the kind of dancer who had learned because it was useful in social situations rather than because he particularly loved it. But he led well, and he did not step on her feet, and he did not fill the dancing time with unnecessary talk. The second dance was a slower piece, and they were closer than the first, and Rosa was deeply, acutely aware of the fact that he smelled like clean wool and some kind of plain soap and the faint dry grass smell of the prairie, and that his hand at her back was warm and steady and made her feel, against all of her carefully maintained architecture of self-sufficiency, very simply and entirely safe. She did not quite trust that feeling. She had felt safe before and been wrong about it. She had been wrong about a man before in ways that had cost her significantly, and she had promised herself, with the particular ferocity of someone who has made a promise while still bleeding, that she would not make that mistake again. So she was careful. She was cordial and warm and genuine in her interactions with Reuben Keating, because she was not capable of being otherwise and did not want to be. But she kept a specific careful distance between what she felt and what she allowed herself to acknowledge, and she did not let herself think too far ahead, and she was, in this way, managing reasonably well. Until the afternoon she overheard the conversation in the hardware store. It was the third week of June. Rosa had gone in to buy nails for a display fixture she was building for the shop, a practical errand, nothing unusual, and she had arrived to find two men she did not know standing near the back of the store in conversation that stopped when they saw her and then resumed in lower voices once they assumed she was not listening. She was not trying to listen. She simply had very good hearing and the store was not large. "Keating's the one who put Finch's brother away," one of the men said. "Chester Finch is not the forgiving type. Chester Finch is also not the patient type," the other said. "He has been in town 3 days and he has been asking questions about the Marshal's habits. Someone ought to tell Keating. Someone ought to mind their own business," the first man said, in a tone that suggested he was looking around nervously, and then they lowered their voices further and Rosa heard nothing more. She paid for her nails and walked back to the shop and spent approximately 20 minutes being very carefully calm before she went to find Helen and said, "Do you know anything about a man named Chester Finch?" Helen's expression shifted in a way that told Rosa everything before she said a word. Helen knew. Of course Helen knew. Helen had lived in this territory for years and knew every current of danger moving through it, and she had not mentioned Chester Finch to Rosa because Rosa was new, and Helen had been protecting her from the worst of it. "Chester Finch," Helen said carefully, "is the younger brother of a man named Dale Finch, who is serving 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth because Reuben Keating gathered the evidence and built the case that put him there 2 years ago. Dale Finch was running a cattle theft operation and had 2 men killed who tried to report him. Reuben spent 8 months on that case. Chester Finch has not forgiven him for it. How dangerous is Chester Finch?" Rosa asked. Helen looked at her steadily. "Dangerous enough that I am going to go talk to Deputy Hale right now," she said, "and you are going to stay here." Rosa had stayed there for approximately 3 minutes before she went to find Reuben Keating herself, because she was not built for staying and waiting, and because the thought of something happening to him while she possessed information that might prevent it was not something she was capable of sitting with. She found him at his office, which was a small frame building next to the jail, and she walked in without knocking and told him what she had heard, directly and completely, without any of the hedging or apologizing or deferring that the situation might have prompted in a different person. He listened without interrupting. His expression remained that precise, readable only if you were paying attention thing, but she was paying attention by now, and she could see him taking the information in, processing it, adding it to whatever he already knew. "How long have you known about Chester Finch?" she asked when she finished. 2 days, he said. "You knew he was in town and you were not particularly worried," she said, reading his expression. "I was prepared," he said, which was different from not worried. "Prepared how?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment and she thought he was going to tell her that this was not her concern, that she should go back to the shop, that he appreciated the information and would handle things from here. She had already prepared her response to that, which was going to be measured and reasonable and not at all the sharp thing she actually wanted to say. Instead he said, "Come in. Sit down. I'll tell you." She sat down across from him at his desk, and he told her precisely and without embellishment what he knew and what he suspected and what he was planning, and the particular quality of that trust, the decision to include her rather than dismiss her, to treat her intelligence as an asset rather than a concern, undid approximately 6 weeks of very careful architecture in about 4 minutes. She did not let it show. She was very good at not letting things show. But she felt it, somewhere deep behind her sternum, the shift and resettle of something fundamental. The plan, such as it was, involved Reuben making his normal rounds, visible and unhurried, while his deputy watched from concealed positions for any move on Chester Finch's part. It was a reasonable plan. Rosa had left the office and gone back to the shop and told Helen, who had told her she had done the right thing, and everything had seemed under control. Except that Chester Finch, who was, as Helen had said, not the patient type, had apparently decided not to wait, and had made his move 3 days later in the middle of the afternoon on Main Street. And this was where Rosa had been when she had watched the gun press against Reuben Keating's temple, and had said what she had said, and the gun had come down. She was still standing in the settling dust of Main Street when Reuben Keating walked back toward her. Chester Finch handed off to the deputy. The immediate crisis resolved, the crowd beginning to dissolve back into its regular afternoon business. He walked directly to her, which she noticed, and he stopped about 2 feet away, which was closer than professional distance, and he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "You should not have done that." "It worked," she said. "You could not have been certain of that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But I was more certain of it than you were of your alternative." Something moved through his eyes, not quite frustration, not quite admiration. Something complicated that partook of both and something else she could not name. "How did you know about his wife?" he said. "Agatha Finch came into the shop last week," Rosa said. "She bought a bonnet and stayed for an hour, and she told me, without knowing she was telling me, everything I needed to know about what her husband was afraid of." She paused. "People talk to seamstresses, Reuben." She had used his name. She had used it several times before in direct conversation, but this was the first time it had come out with that particular ease, and she heard it herself and felt the small, significant shift it represented. He heard it too. She could tell by the way he looked at her, the way his expression did that fine-grained thing that required attention to read. "Rosa," he said, and her name in his voice was something she did not have an immediate category for. "Yes," she said very calmly, because one of them needed to be. "Would you have dinner with me?" he said. "Not at the hotel dining room, not anything that involves the entire town watching, but at the Carver house, where my deputy's mother runs a boarding-house supper, and it is private and the food is considerably better." She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "Yes." The Carver house supper happened 4 days later, on a Wednesday evening, and it was the most honestly good time Rosa Redmond had spent in approximately 2 years. Margaret Carver was a woman in her mid-50s who cooked with the focused dedication of someone who considered it an art form, and had absolutely no patience for people who disagreed with that assessment. She served them beef stew with biscuits that were the best Rosa had ever tasted, and a dried apple pie that was almost unreasonably good. And she made no attempt whatsoever to be discreet about the fact that she had been hoping Reuben Keating would bring someone to her table for the better part of a year. "He works too hard," Margaret told Rosa cheerfully, while Reuben was washing his hands. "He is over there at that office at all hours, and he does not eat properly when left entirely to himself. He is the finest man I know, and someone ought to tell him that more often." "I suspect he would find that uncomfortable," Rosa said. "Deeply," Margaret agreed, with evident satisfaction. Reuben returned to the table and gave Margaret a look that suggested he had heard at least some portion of this exchange, and Margaret served the stew with a serenity that suggested she did not care in the least. They talked through the entire meal. This surprised Rosa, not because she had expected silence, but because she had not expected the particular quality of conversation that emerged, direct and curious and genuinely interested. The kind of talking that happens between people who are both used to being careful and have decided, for reasons they have not fully articulated even to themselves, to be a little less careful than usual. He told her about Lawrence, about growing up the son of a blacksmith in a town that had been burned and rebuilt and burned and rebuilt again, and had emerged from that violence with a particular kind of resolve that he thought he had absorbed through the soil under his feet. He was 7 during the raid of 1863, old enough to remember it, young enough that the memory was more sensory than narrative, smoke and his mother's arms and the specific silence afterward, and he thought it was probably the moment when he had decided, though he had not had words for it yet, that protecting people from the worst of what could happen was the kind of work worth doing. Rosa told him about independence, about her father and his schoolroom, and the books that had been her primary companions after her mother died. about the way her father had never treated her intelligence as unusual or requiring management, had simply assumed she was capable of everything and handed her books and got out of the way. About St. Louis and the dress shop and Gerald Voss, whose name she said levelly and without particular emphasis, though she felt Reuben register the name and file it carefully, asking nothing yet but leaving space for more later if she chose. She chose. Not everything, not all at once, but the relevant parts. That Gerald had seemed, for nearly 2 years, to be exactly what he presented himself as, a merchant's son with good prospects and a warm manner and no obvious dark past, and that the dark past had existed regardless of its concealment, and that when she had finally seen it clearly, finally allowed herself to understand what she had been looking at and choosing not to see, she had ended the engagement and left the city, and spent approximately 6 months putting herself back together from first principles. Reuben listened to all of this without the expression she had expected, not the careful sympathy that was really pity, not the slight discomfort of a man who does not know what to do with a woman's emotional history, not the implicit suggestion that she might have handled it differently. He listened the way he did everything, with full attention and no performance, and when she finished he said simply, "He did not deserve you." "No," she agreed, "he did not. But I think the more important thing I learned is that I deserve better than believing I can see something clearly when what I am actually doing is choosing not to look." Reuben considered this. "That is a hard thing to learn," he said. "It is," Rosa said, "but useful." He walked her back to the house where she boarded, 3 blocks from the shop in the warm dark of the August evening, and at the door he did not kiss her and did not ask if he could, but he held her hand for a moment, both his hands around hers, and looked at her with that expression she was getting better at reading and said, "I would like to do this again." "I would like that too," Rosa said. They did it again, and again. And in the way of things that have their own gravity and their own momentum, the weeks that followed became the months of a courtship that was unlike anything Rosa had experienced or imagined for herself. Not theatrical or performed, but deeply, quietly real, built in increments of trust and conversation, and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have both been careful for a long time and have decided together to be less so. He brought her things sometimes. A wildflower he had found that he thought might be something she had mentioned reading about. A newspaper from Wichita with an article about fashion trends that he thought might interest her professionally. A book of poetry by Emily Dickinson, presented without ceremony or explanation, as though it simply belonged to her. She brought him things too. She mended his coat when it tore, a service he tried to pay for and she refused, and in refusing established a precedent of mutual care that felt more significant to both of them than they articulated. She wrote down a recipe from Margaret Carver for the biscuits and left it on his desk with a note that said simply, "So you can eat properly when left to yourself." She listened, on the evenings when he came to her with the particular kind of tiredness that was not physical but something heavier, when the territory's violence and injustice had been louder than usual, when a man had been killed or wronged or a situation had been handled badly, and there was nothing to be done about it now. She listened without trying to fix it, which was what he needed, and she could tell from the way he looked at her afterward that he knew what she was giving him and what it cost her, because she was fundamentally a problem solver and sitting with unsolvable things was not her natural state. There were things that complicated the landscape. The territory in 1882 was not simple in its politics or its social architecture, and Reuben's work existed at the intersection of multiple conflicting pressures that were not going to resolve themselves cleanly. The cattle trail was beginning to wind down as the railroads pushed further south and west, and Caldwell was at the beginning of a transition that would, over the next few years, change its character significantly. The Cheyenne and Arapaho nations to the south were navigating the particular injustice of reservation policies that were simultaneously making demands on their land and their culture that Rosa found, when she learned the specifics, deeply troubling. She said so to Reuben one evening when he had returned from a meeting at the federal office in Wichita about land surveys near the reservation boundaries. She said it directly, which was her way. He looked at her without surprise. "I know," he said. "I have said so formally twice. I have been told that my job is to maintain order, not to set policy." "That is an unsatisfying answer," Rosa said. "I know that too," he said, and there was a weight behind it that told her this was not something he had made peace with, and that the gap between the work he could do and the work that needed doing was something he carried. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and neither of them said anything more about it that evening. But the gesture was a kind of acknowledgement that they were in the same moral place, looking at the same difficult landscape, and refusing to pretend it was anything other than what it was. There were also things between them personally that needed resolving, and one of them Rosa had been aware of for approximately 6 weeks before she finally addressed it directly. He had a dark past of his own. Not dark in the way Gerald Voss's had been, not hidden and dishonest and fundamentally about self-interest, but dark in the way that anyone's history is dark when it has involved real violence and real loss. There had been a partner, a man he had served with in his first posting in Dodge City, who had died because of a decision Reuben had made, a decision that had been the right call by every possible measure, and that had nonetheless resulted in death. And the weight of it sat in him in a particular way she had noticed early, and named to herself correctly before she named it to him. She named it to him on a September evening when they were sitting on Helen's porch after supper, and he had that particular quality of stillness that meant something was pressing on him from inside. "You have not told me about Dodge City," she said. He went very still for a moment, and then he told her. His voice was even throughout, the same steady baritone, but she could feel the cost of the telling, the way some things are carried so long they become load-bearing, and the question of what happens when you put them down is genuinely uncertain. She listened to all of it. She did not flinch from any of it. When he finished, she said, "You made the best decision available to you with the information you had and within the constraints of the situation. The outcome was terrible, and you bear the weight of it because you loved him and because you are the kind of person who carries things. But it is not guilt you are carrying. It is grief." He looked at her for a long time. "How can you tell the difference?" he said. "Because guilt says I did wrong," she said. "What you are saying is that something wrong happened and I could not stop it. That is different." He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she began to wonder if she had said something that had not landed the way she intended, and then he said, in a voice that was slightly different from his usual one, "Nobody has ever said that to me before." "Then I am glad I said it," Rosa said simply. The shift in what they were to each other happened not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of them. And by October they had stopped pretending, even in the privacy of their own thoughts, that this was anything other than what it was, which was a love that had built itself from the ground up out of the specific materials of who they actually were, without performance and without pretense, and without either of them being anything other than themselves. He kissed her for the first time on a cool October evening outside her boarding house, the kind of kiss that has been preceded by 3 months of accumulated wanting, and is therefore not tentative at all, but is also not rushed, deliberate and warm and entirely itself. And afterward she stood on the step above him so that they were eye to eye, and she looked at him for a moment and said, "I wondered when you would get around to that." He smiled properly then, the full version she had only seen fragments of before, and it changed his face entirely, and she wanted to put her hand against it, and she did, and he turned his head slightly to press against her palm and closed his eyes for a moment, and it was one of those moments that is so simple and so complete that it almost cannot be contained in ordinary time. "Rosa," he said. "Yes," she said, for the second time, because that was still the right answer. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was cold and eventful and full of the specific texture of two people who have decided on each other, and are now doing the daily work of being known to each other more completely, which is a different and more demanding project than the initial work of deciding. Chester Finch went to trial in November. He was convicted on charges of assault and threatening a federal officer, and sentenced to 3 years in the county jail. His wife Agatha came to Rosa 2 days after the sentencing and sat in the millinery shop for an hour in silence and then said, "I knew something like this was going to happen. I knew it for years." Rosa did not say anything easy in response, because easy things were not what was needed, but she kept the tea warm and she sat with Agatha until the silence felt more like release than grief, and when Agatha left she looked steadier than when she had come in. Rosa told Reuben about the visit that evening. He listened and said, "You are very good at being with people in hard moments." "My father taught me," she said. "He said the most important thing you can do for someone in pain is not try to fix it. Just stay." Reuben looked at her with that expression she had long since learned to read, the one that meant he was feeling something specific and significant and was deciding whether to say it. She waited. "I want to marry you," he said. "I have wanted to say that for at least 6 weeks. I wanted to say it properly, with more ceremony, but I find I cannot wait any more." Rosa looked at him steadily. Her heart was doing the runaway horse thing again. She had been expecting this and simultaneously had not quite been prepared for it, which was the nature of moments that matter. "I want to marry you too," she said, "and I do not need ceremony. I need honesty and presence and someone who picks up what needs carrying without being asked. You are all of those things. I am also someone who will worry about you every time you step between a man with a gun and his target," he said. "And I am someone who will lie awake wondering if you are all right every time you ride out on a case," she said. "We will manage it. We will manage it," he agreed. He had a ring. He had, it turned out, had it for approximately 2 weeks. A simple gold band with a small garnet set in it that he had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita after describing Rosa's coloring to the man in what she imagined had been a deeply uncomfortable conversation. He put it on her finger and it fit, not perfectly, but close enough. And the garnet was the exact dark red of a New Mexican sunset, and she loved it entirely. Helen Cartwright, upon being told, cried, which Rosa had not expected, and then explained, while pressing her handkerchief to her face, that she had known from the moment Reuben carried Rosa's trunk that this was inevitable, and she had merely been waiting for the two of them to stop being professionally careful about it. "You could have told me," Rosa said. "Darling," Helen said, with great affection, "you were not ready to be told for at least 2 months." Rosa could not entirely argue with this assessment. They were married in March of 1883, on the 15th, a Saturday, in the small church on the north end of Commerce Street, in a ceremony performed by Reverend Thomas Aldrich, who was a good and practical man who kept the ceremony brief and the sentiment genuine. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with small blue flowers embroidered at the collar and cuffs, and she carried a small bouquet of early prairie flowers that Reuben had found that morning, and presented with his customary absence of theatrical gesture and presence of genuine feeling. Helen stood up with Rosa. Reuben's deputy, a young man named Samuel Hale who had been clearly worshipful of Reuben for years and was trying to contain his emotion with limited success, stood up with Reuben. The church was full. Caldwell was a town of 900 people, and most of them had opinions about Reuben Keating, most of those opinions being highly favorable, and those opinions extended by rapid community consensus to Rosa, who had in 10 months become as much a part of the town's fabric as anyone who had lived there 20 years. When they said their vows, they looked at each other with the specific attention of people who mean exactly what they are saying, and the Reverend, who had conducted a great many ceremonies in his years, told his wife that evening that it was one of the truest things he had witnessed in quite some time. They moved into a small frame house on the east side of town that had been empty for a year and needed work, and they did the work together over the spring and early summer, which Rosa found was one of the better ways to learn someone in their practical habits. Reuben was methodical and thorough and deeply patient with processes that required care. He did not rush things that should not be rushed. He also did not know a great deal about interior arrangements and was entirely comfortable deferring to Rosa on such matters, which she appreciated not because she needed the deference, but because the willingness to defer without ego was its own kind of information about a person. She planted a kitchen garden in June. He built her a raised bed for it out of salvaged lumber, the measurements precise and the corners properly squared. And the morning she found it finished and waiting, she stood in the early light looking at it with a feeling in her chest that was too large for its simple cause. And she understood that the feeling was not really about the raised bed, but about the accumulated evidence of being seen and cared for by someone who did these things not as a negotiation or a performance, but simply because they mattered. She was pregnant by July, a discovery she made on a morning when she was too nauseous to eat breakfast and stood in the kitchen working through the possible explanations with the same logical thoroughness she applied to most things, and arrived at the most likely conclusion, and then sat down with her tea and felt a particular profound stillness settle over her. She told Reuben that evening. She had thought about how to say it and had decided that the best approach was the direct one, which was her usual approach to things that mattered. "I think we are having a child," she said. Reuben looked up from the report he had been reading. He looked at her for a moment, processing, and then something happened to his face that she had not seen before. Not the measured, fine-grained expression she had learned over the past year, but something much more open, almost unguarded, like a door that has been closed for a long time opening all the way. "Are you well?" he said immediately, which she thought was the exactly correct first response. "I am somewhat nauseous in the mornings," she said, "but otherwise quite well." He got up from his chair and came to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then kissed her with the particular quality of someone who is feeling something too large to put in a sentence and is putting it in the only other available place. And Rosa put her hands over his and kissed him back, and they stayed like that in the kitchen of their small house in the early evening light for a long time. He worried, which she had expected. He tried not to let the worrying become something that constrained her, which she appreciated. He deferred to the doctor in Caldwell on medical matters and deferred to Rosa on everything else, which was the appropriate division of authority. He also, in the months that followed, developed a habit of reading aloud to her in the evenings, partly because she liked it, and partly because it gave him something to do with his hands that was not the covert watchfulness of an anxious spouse, and she let this go unremarked because it was both endearing and genuinely pleasant. He read her Jane Austen and Charles Dickens, and the complete works of Mark Twain, and a history of the American West that was by turns illuminating and infuriating in its omissions. And she listened with one hand on her growing stomach and her feet tucked under a quilt, and felt, in those evenings, a happiness so quiet and so complete that it had the quality of something that had always been waiting for her to find it. Their son was born on the 23rd of February, 1884, after a difficult labor that lasted most of a day, and during which Reuben, who faced genuine physical danger regularly without any apparent concern, sat in the hallway of their house and aged visibly. The doctor and the midwife both assured him repeatedly that everything was progressing normally. He was not comforted by this information. He sat in the hall and was not comforted, with a focused, controlled anxiety that was entirely unlike his usual self. And Rosa, who could hear him moving occasionally and was dealing with rather more pressing concerns than her husband's emotional state, nonetheless thought about him continuously in the gaps between contractions, and found that this was not an annoyance but something that felt very much like its opposite. The boy was born at 4:30 in the afternoon. He was healthy and loud, and had his father's dark hair and his mother's exact expression of determined appraisal, taking in the room with the focused attention of someone who intends to understand where they have arrived. Reuben was allowed in approximately 15 minutes after the birth and stood at the foot of the bed looking at both of them with an expression that Rosa would describe later as the only time she had ever seen him entirely at a loss for the controlled, purposeful calm that was his native register. "He is all right," Reuben said, which was his second entirely correct first response. "He is perfect," Rosa said. "Come here." He came to her and she put the boy in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time, the large, capable hands incredibly careful. The broad shoulders curved around this small new person with a protectiveness that was different from the protectiveness he brought to his work, more foundational, more vulnerable. And she loved him so much in that moment that it was almost a physical thing, a weight and a warmth simultaneously, something she could have held in her hands. "What shall we call him?" Reuben asked. "James," she said, "for my father." He looked at her. "James," he said, as though testing the weight of it, and she could tell that he loved the choice and was grateful for it and did not know quite how to say so. "And your father's name as a middle name, if you would like," she said. "William," he said. "James William Keating." He looked at the boy. "That is a good name." It was a good name. James William Keating was a good baby, in the sense that he was healthy and robust and had clear preferences and communicated them without ambiguity, which Rosa thought was an excellent foundation for a personality. He was also, it became apparent fairly quickly, exceptionally curious about the world, which manifested early as a tendency to attempt to interact with everything within reach and later, as a conversational intensity that was exhausting and endearing in equal measure. Caldwell changed around them through those years, as it had been beginning to change when Rosa arrived. The cattle drives diminished and then stopped, and the town's economy shifted toward farming and small business, and the particular wild energy of a cattle trail town settled into something more domestic and more settled. It was not a bad change. It was simply a change, the town becoming a different version of itself, which was the story of every place that survived its frontier period. Reuben continued his work, and the work changed too. By 1885, much of the immediate physical danger of the early years had receded, though it never entirely disappeared, and his role shifted toward more administrative responsibilities, the coordination of territorial policing, the interface between local law and the federal structures that were increasingly present in the region. He was good at all of it and found the administrative work less satisfying than the direct work, which he told Rosa honestly, and she told him she understood, because she felt the same thing about the aspects of running a business that were paperwork rather than craft. They argued sometimes because they were two strong-willed, independently minded people living in genuine close quarters, and because real love does not dissolve the friction of different perspectives, but rather creates a context in which that friction can be worked through rather than avoided. They argued about practical things mostly, about priorities in time and the management of resources, and occasionally about larger things, about when and how much risk was acceptable, and what they owed the community and what they owed each other and themselves. Their arguments had a particular shape. They were direct and complete, neither of them given to the passive accumulation of grievance or the strategic deployment of old wounds. They said what they actually meant, because they were both people who had learned the cost of not doing so, and they listened to each other with the same quality of full attention they brought to everything, and they generally arrived, through a combination of persuasion and genuine openness to being persuaded, at something better than either of them had started with. Rosa sometimes thought about Gerald Voss and about the quality of arguments she might have had with him, the evasion and the hidden motives, and the fundamental dishonesty that would have made every difficult conversation a negotiation with someone who was not showing their real hand. And the contrast with what she had built with Reuben was so complete that it almost felt like the difference between two different worlds rather than two different men. In the spring of 1886, Rosa discovered she was pregnant again. This discovery came with somewhat less of the profound stillness and somewhat more of a practical orientation toward the question of how they were going to arrange things, because James was now 2 years old and extremely energetic, and the small house was already at capacity in a logistical sense. They had the conversation about the house that evening, seated at the kitchen table with James already in bed and the spring evening coming through the open window, and decided with their usual directness and efficiency that they needed a larger place, and that Reuben had been looking at a piece of land outside of town for approximately a year without mentioning it because he was not certain whether Rosa wanted to be further from the shop. "Tell me about the land," Rosa said. He told her. 80 acres east of town, a portion of it good farmland and the rest good grazing, with a creek running through the lower portion and several mature cottonwood trees that he described with a restraint that she immediately recognized as poorly disguised love for the place. "Have you already decided you want it?" she asked. "I did not want to decide without you," he said. "Reuben," she said, gently and directly, "I can see it in your face. Have you already decided you want it?" A pause. "Yes," he said. "Then why are we having a conversation that begins with you telling me about it as though you have not already decided?" He looked at her for a moment. "Because I genuinely want to know what you want. And if I said I did not want it, then we would not buy it," he said, without hesitation. She looked at him, this man she had married and known and loved for 3 years now, and thought, not for the first time, about the trunk, about the morning on the platform and the rain and the simple, unreflective decision to pick up what needed carrying. It was such a small thing, and it had told her so much, and she thought sometimes about how much of a person's character lived in the small things, the automatic choices, the habits of care and decency and presence that were too ordinary to perform, and therefore were purely themselves. "I want to see it," she said, "this week, and if it is what you say it is, then I think we should buy it." It was what he said it was, and they bought it, and spent the summer of 1886 and the fall and the early winter working on the house, which was a larger project than the first house had been, and was consequently more complicated and more satisfying, and the particular pleasure of building something together that was meant to hold them and their children for decades was a pleasure that did not diminish with the practical difficulties of the project. Their daughter was born in November of 1886, a month earlier than expected, which produced a sharp anxiety for several days before the doctor confirmed that she was small but entirely well, and suggested that her early arrival was less evidence of difficulty than of impatience, which Rosa thought was probably an accurate prognosis for her character. They named her Alina after Reuben's mother, and she had Rosa's coloring, the dark eyes and the black hair, and she had Reuben's way of looking at things with that precise, assessing attention, and she was from her earliest weeks a person of extremely clear preferences and extremely effective communication, which both her parents respected and which made the early months somewhat exhausting. James was fascinated by Alina. He regarded her with the particular intense interest of a child who has encountered something new and is determined to understand it completely, and his attempts to communicate with her, which began as a kind of earnest commentary delivered to her cradle and evolved as she grew into an actual bilateral exchange of increasing complexity, were one of the continuous joys of the household. Reuben watched his children with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything, and Rosa watched him watching them, and the love that accumulated in that watching and in the daily texture of their life together, the meals and the arguments and the reading aloud in the evenings and the work and the worry and the small habitual kindnesses, had by now a weight and a completeness that she thought sometimes could not have been predicted from any of its individual components. Like how a house is more than its lumber and its nails. She had a moment, one evening in the winter of 1886, sitting by the fire in the new house with Alina asleep against her chest and James, and Reuben on the floor on the other side of the fireplace, engaged in some complex game involving wooden blocks and an elaborate narrative that Reuben was contributing to with entirely serious investment. When she thought about the train platform in May of 1882, with the rain coming sideways and the note in her hand, and the $37, and the plan that was already unraveling, and how she could not have imagined, not in any version of the future she had been capable of constructing at that moment, the specific dimensions of what she was sitting inside of now. She thought about how most of the best things in her life had been things she had not been able to predict or plan for. The shop with Helen, the particular quality of Caldwell itself, the way it was a real place with real people and real stakes, and not the abstraction of relocation she had been seeking when she answered the advertisement. The social in the church hall in June and the fiddle music and the dancing. The conversation over potluck supper and the recognition, not sudden but gradual, and then at some point undeniable, that she had found something she had not quite known she was looking for. And before all of that, on a cold, rain-wet morning on a train platform, a man who had simply picked up what needed carrying and walked beside her without any expectation of gratitude or credit or anything other than the simple practical fact of its needing doing, and who had, in that unremarkable and entirely unrepeatable moment, shown her everything she needed to know about who he was. She had never quite forgotten that moment. She thought she probably never would. James looked up from the wooden blocks and announced that the tower had to be taller than the barn, and could his father reach the highest block from where he was sitting? Reuben considered the question with full seriousness and adjusted his position and reached the block and handed it over with the gravity of a man engaged in a project of genuine architectural significance, and James accepted it with an equal seriousness and placed it with the focused care of someone who understands that some things need to be done right. Rosa looked at them both across the fire and pressed her lips to the top of a leaner, sleeping head. "Reuben," she said. He looked up across James's absorbed concentration across the fire. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she could see him considering what the thanks was for, this specific thing or the larger accumulated thing it represented, and she watched him arrive at both and find them equally true. "Rosa," he said. And then, because some things do not require elaboration, he simply looked at her with that expression, the full version of it, the one she had first seen in its partial forms on a train platform and a main street and a boarding house supper table, and on every ordinary and extraordinary day of the years between those moments and this one. She held that look in both hands, metaphorically speaking, and held it carefully, the way you hold things that are at once very fragile and very strong, and the fire crackled and James placed his block, and a leaner breathed against her chest with the steady rhythm of deep sleep. And outside the Kansas winter pressed against the windows of the new house and found nothing to come through, and the room held what it held, which was everything. By the spring of 1887, they had settled into the new house with the completeness of people who have found the place that fits. Rosa had expanded her work with Helen's shop, taking on the management of the millinery's finances as Helen began to think about a partial retirement, and had also begun teaching a sewing class on Saturday mornings for the women and older girls in town who wanted to learn, which she found she loved with a specificity that surprised her. There was something in the teaching that returned her to her father and his schoolroom, to the particular pleasure of watching someone understand something new and feel themselves become more capable, and she brought to it the same directness and patience and refusal to condescend that had characterized his classroom. Reuben continued his work, and had by this point a reputation in the territory that was both wide and specific, the reputation of someone who was absolutely reliable, not in the narrow sense of following rules, but in the deeper sense of understanding what rules were for and honoring the intention behind them when the rule itself fell short. He had built relationships with the leaders of the Cheyenne communities to the south, Relationships built on the foundation of treating those communities with the same respect and serious engagement he brought to any human endeavor. And those relationships had, on several occasions, been the difference between a situation escalating into violence and a situation being resolved through conversation. He had also, in 1886, submitted a formal report to the federal office in Wichita detailing the specific ways in which the current reservation policies were failing the people they were supposed to serve, and had been told that his observations were noted and would be considered, which he had received with the equanimity of someone who has learned the difference between what should happen and what will happen but continues to do the former regardless. "Does it frustrate you?" Rosa asked him, one evening after he had come home from a week in Wichita for meetings that had been, by his account, productive in the narrow technical sense and deeply unsatisfying in the larger moral sense. "Yes," he said, "every day." "Then why do you stay in the work?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because the alternative is not doing it," he said, "and someone has to do it. And if someone has to do it, it might as well be someone who finds it frustrating for the right reasons." Rosa thought about this answer for several days afterward. She thought it was one of the most honest descriptions of a certain kind of adult responsibility that she had ever heard, and she told him so eventually, and he looked slightly surprised, which was rare, and then slightly pleased, which was rarer. The years moved with the rhythm of a life that has found its pace. James started school and was immediately and comprehensively excellent at reading and mathematics, and the particular kind of independent thinking that his teacher found simultaneously admirable and challenging to manage. Eleanor, who learned to walk at 10 months with the same impatience that had characterized her birth, spoke her first full sentence at 15 months, which was, "I want to see the horses," delivered with the precise enunciation of someone who has been working on this communication for some time and is now deploying it to maximum effect. Reuben began teaching both children to ride when James was 4 and Eleanor was 2, in sessions of great practicality and equal entertainment, and Rosa watched from the fence with the specific pleasure of someone watching something being done well. The patience and the clear instruction and the absolute seriousness with which he treated both children's efforts and concerns, never dismissing what they found difficult, never performing patience he did not actually have. She became pregnant for the third time in the early spring of 1889, a discovery that arrived with more equanimity than either of the previous ones, partly because she was now 33 and had more experience of the whole business, and partly because she had, by this point, a genuine understanding of her own physical needs and rhythms that allowed her to manage the pregnancy with some confidence. She was well throughout and she worked throughout, and she told Reuben at 4 months, which was later than either of the previous times, and he looked at her steadily when she told him and said, "You have been managing this on your own for 4 months." "I was well," she said. "I knew what to watch for," he nodded slowly. "I would have liked to know," he said, not as a complaint but as an honest statement of feeling. She considered this. "I know," she said. "I will tell you earlier next time." "There will be a next time," he said. "If we keep living the way we are living," she said, "probably." He smiled at this, the full version, and she smiled back. And they sat in the kitchen of the house they had built together, and she thought about the words "next time" and all that they implied. The ongoing project, the continued commitment, the future that extended outward from where they were sitting in a direction that was full of things neither of them could predict, but both of them were willing to walk toward together. Their second son was born in November of 1889, a healthy boy of what the doctor called a good generous size, with Rosa's dark hair and Reuben's eyes, which were a specific shade of brown with gold in them that Rosa had spent years noticing, and now recognized in this new face with a pleasure that was both aesthetic and deeply personal. They named him Thomas, for Rosa's father, who had died quietly in his sleep in Independence in the summer of 1888, and whom Rosa had mourned with the particular quality of grief that comes from losing someone who was also a teacher, the compound loss of the person, and of a certain kind of being known. Reuben had held her in that grief with the same quality of full presence he brought to everything, the not trying to fix it, the just staying. And she had thought about what she had told him years before about her father's teaching and about sitting with unsolvable things, and had felt, in his arms on the evening after the telegram arrived, the specific completeness of being held by someone who had learned from you and was returning what you taught. Thomas William James Keating, which was his full name, entered the world with volume and intent, and was from his earliest days a person of tremendous energy and robust humor, capable of laughing before he was capable of many other things. And this humor settled into his personality as he grew into a steadiness that was somehow both entirely his own and also recognizably inherited from both his parents in different proportions. By 1890, the household on the 80 acres outside Caldwell was full of the specific noise and texture of a family in full operation. James was 6 and Eleanor was 3 and Thomas was an infant, and the house, which had seemed large when they built it, had developed a tendency to feel somewhat less large, particularly on winter days when everyone was inside. Rosa looked at this sometimes, the practical architecture of what they had made, and thought about the train platform and the $37 and the plan that had been unraveling, and about how she had not been looking for this specific thing, this house and this man and these children and this daily particular complicated beautiful life, but that she had been, she thought, capable of it all along. And it had required only the accident of a rainy morning, and a trunk that needed carrying to put her in the place where it could find her. She thought about the secrets she had carried to Caldwell, the wound of Gerald Voss and the year of rebuilding, and the deep, hard-won suspicion of her own capacity to see clearly what was in front of her. She thought about how those secrets had shaped the careful way she had approached Reuben, the measured distance she had maintained, the specific points at which she had tested the distance, and found it insufficient and moved, incrementally and then decisively, toward him. She thought about his dark past and the weight he had carried from Dodge City and the way she had been able to give it back to him named differently, grief instead of guilt, and how he had looked at her when she said it, with that open, unguarded quality she had only seen that one time, and how that moment had probably, though she could not be certain, been the moment when he had decided something too. The trunk had been the beginning. The carrying of a plain, heavy wooden trunk in the rain on a Thursday morning in May. No performance, no expectation, no particular awareness that it was significant, just the direct and simple response to what was there and what needed doing. She had never been able to forget it, not because it was dramatic, but because it was its opposite, because in a world full of men who made gestures and performed intentions, it had been the rarest possible thing, which was a man who simply was what he was without arrangement or audience. She was sitting on the porch in the September evening of 1890, watching the low sun make long shadows across the prairie grass, when Reuben came out of the house and sat down beside her. Thomas was inside asleep. James was in the barn finishing his evening chores with the slightly martyred air of a 6-year-old, who would rather be doing something else. Eleanor was chasing something in the tall grass beyond the fence line, possibly a grasshopper, possibly a principal. It was sometimes difficult to tell. Reuben sat beside her and was quiet for a moment, and she looked at his profile in the evening light, the jaw and the eyes and the way he held himself. This person she knew so thoroughly and continued to find interesting. And she thought about the fact that she was 34 years old and had been in Caldwell for 8 years and had been married for 7, and was sitting on the porch of a house she had helped build on the edge of the Kansas prairie in the long September evening, with the smell of grass and wood smoke and a good meal faintly in the air. And she was happy. She was genuinely, specifically, completely happy. Not the absence of difficulty or the absence of worry or the absence of the complex freight of being a person alive in a complicated world, but the presence of something positive and full, an affirmative condition, a yes at the center of things. "You are thinking about something," Reuben said, not as an inquiry but as an observation. "The porch on Commerce Street," she said. "That evening in September when I told you about Gerald Voss." He turned to look at her. "What about it?" "I was thinking about how I told you and you did not flinch," she said. "And that was the first time I understood that you were someone I could trust with the actual shape of things." He was quiet for a moment. "You are the least flinchable person I have ever met," he said. "It seemed only reasonable to try to be the same." She laughed. She laughed genuinely, the full version, and he watched her laughing with his expression doing that fine-grained thing that she could read completely now, which was saying "I love you" without saying it, not because it went unsaid between them, but because it had also this wordless register, this continuous quiet frequency that was present underneath everything and sometimes surfaced in a look. "Reuben," she said when she had stopped laughing. "Yes," he said. "I want another one," she said. "Eventually, not right now." "But eventually." He held her gaze for a moment and she could see him processing this through the layers, the practical and the emotional and the medical and the personal, all of it simultaneously, which was one of the things she loved about him, the way he took things seriously without making them heavier than they needed to be. "All right," he said. "Just like that," she said. "You want something," he said. "I want what you want, when the time is right." She leaned against him, her shoulder to his arm, and he shifted to put his arm around her. And they sat like that in the September evening watching a leaner in the grass and listening to the sounds of James in the barn and Thomas sleeping somewhere inside. And the prairie stretched out in front of them in the long golden light of the turning year, wide and particular and full of the specific beauty that exists only in places that have been truly looked at. The fourth child came in 1892, a girl they named Margaret, after Margaret Carver, who had died the previous year, and who had been in her quiet way one of the foundational people of their life in Caldwell. The best biscuits and the warmest table, and the completely unembarrassed declaration of affection for Reuben that Rosa had found on that first evening, both entirely accurate and deeply funny. They named the girl Margaret Rosa, actually, which was Helen's suggestion and which made Rosa cry when she heard it. One of the rare times, which Reuben held and did not comment on except to press his lips to her temple and keep his arms where they were until she was done. By 1893, the family had its full shape. James was 9, Eleanor was 6, Thomas was 3, and Margaret was 1. And the house had expanded by a room and a half and the kitchen garden had expanded considerably. And the barn had 3 horses and a milk cow, and a population of chickens with highly individual personalities that the children had named, and Reuben affected to find exasperating and actually found completely charming. Helen Cartwright retired in the spring of 1893 and sold the millinery shop to Rosa, which was the only sale that made sense, and which Rosa had known was coming for 2 years and had been quietly preparing for. She ran the shop with Helen's warm businesslike spirit and her own particular addition to it, the sewing classes, which had expanded and formalized, and were attended by a wide range of women, including several who had gone on to do work of their own, which gave Rosa a specific professional pride that was different from any other kind. She thought sometimes about what her father would have made of it, the teaching and the shop, and the practical way her mother's craft had become a livelihood and a community. She thought he would have been pleased, not just by the success of it but by the particular combination of pragmatism and generosity that characterized it, the willingness to share what she knew, which he had modeled and she had inherited. Reuben received an offer in 1893 from the federal office to take a supervisory position in Wichita, with a significant increase in authority and in pay, and he came home with the letter and put it on the kitchen table and sat down across from Rosa and waited for her to read it. She read it carefully. She looked up at him. She could see in that fine-grained, readable expression What he thought about it, not certainty but the particular shape of uncertainty that means you know what you want but are genuinely unwilling to weight the scales before the conversation is had. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "Reuben," she said, with the gentle directness she had used before, "I know you want to know what I think. I am asking what you want." He looked at her for a moment. "I want to stay here," he said. "I want this house and this town and this particular piece of work. I think what I do here matters in a specific way that a supervisory role in Wichita would not." A pause. "But I would go if you wanted the opportunity it represents." "I do not want the opportunity it represents," she said. "I have the opportunity I want right here and I do not want to dismantle it." He looked at the letter and then at her. "We are staying," he said. "We are staying," she agreed. He wrote the refusal that evening, a polite and complete letter, and Rosa sealed it herself and took it to the post office the next morning, and that was the end of the Wichita question. Caldwell entered the 1890s as a different town than it had been in 1882, quieter and more settled, its frontier period behind it now, and a more domestic future in front of it, which was neither better nor worse than what it had been but simply different. The families who had established themselves there, the Keatings among them, were the architecture of what it was becoming, and Rosa sometimes felt herself as part of the structure of a place, which was a new kind of belonging for someone who had come west feeling like an exile looking for a refuge. She was not an exile anymore. She had not been an exile for years. She was a woman of this place, known and knowing, rooted. And if she thought sometimes about the strangeness of how she had arrived here, and what she had been carrying then, and what she had been afraid of, and what had happened to all of that fear, she thought about it with the affectionate clarity of someone who can see the whole shape of a thing from a sufficient distance. On a May morning in 1893, 11 years after her arrival, the date she had realized only when she sat down and counted, Rosa Redmond Keating walked to the train station on an errand, something simple and practical, the collection of a delivery that had come in from a supplier in Kansas City, fabric for the shop, several bolts of good cotton, and one particularly fine wool. She stood on the platform in the morning sun, which was warm now, the May of 1893 entirely unlike the May of 1882. And she watched the train pull in with the same satisfaction she had always felt at the mechanical efficiency of it, the enormous machinery of the world arranging itself to move things from one place to another. The delivery was there, and the station master helped her load the bolts onto the small wagon she had brought, and she was tying them down against the wind when she heard footsteps behind her, and turned to find Reuben standing on the platform, still in his good hat and his Marshal's duster with the badge catching the morning light, looking at her with that expression that she knew in all its versions and still found she had not fully exhausted. "What are you doing here?" she said. "I had a meeting at the telegraph office," he said. "I saw your wagon." He came to where she was standing, and without a word, without being asked, without any apparent awareness that this was anything other than the obvious thing to do, he lifted the heaviest bolt of fabric and resettled it more securely, and finished tying it down with the practiced ease of a man who is simply doing what needs doing. She watched him do it. She watched his hands on the rope, the careful, efficient knot, the slight adjustment for the wind, and she felt something move through her that was not quite any single emotion, but was all of them simultaneously, layered and warm and complete. And she thought about a wooden trunk on a rainy platform in May of 1882, and about everything that had happened between that moment and this one, and about the fact that the gesture was the same, unchanged and unself-conscious, 11 years on. The same simple, unreflective choice to pick up what needed carrying. He straightened up and looked at her. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He smiled at her, the full version, the one that changed his face entirely. "You never need to thank me," he said. "I know," she said. "I do it anyway." She took his hand, standing on the platform in the May morning with the train pulling away behind them and the town of Caldwell stretching out in front of them. The town that was theirs now in the deep sense of having been chosen and chosen and chosen again, every day for 11 years. And she held his hand in both of hers the way he had held hers once on a boarding house doorstep. And she was 37 years old and the mother of 4 children and the owner of a millinery shop, and a woman who had come west with $37 and a plan that was unraveling. And she was standing in the sun with her husband's hand in hers, and nothing was unraveling. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. She had never quite forgotten the trunk, and she thought she never would. It was the beginning of everything, that small, unremarkable moment, and it lived in her as a kind of foundational memory. The note struck at the very start of a long piece of music that gave the whole composition its key, its character, the specific quality of what everything afterward would become. She had spent her life before Caldwell, being careful about who she let carry things for her, in every sense. She had learned, through the specific curriculum of loss and repair, to be self-sufficient and self-reliant and suspicious of rescue. And those were good lessons, and she had needed them, and she did not regret them. But she had learned, in the years since, something that was equally true and more difficult, which was that self-sufficiency and being in partnership were not opposites, that letting someone help you was not the same as needing to be saved, that the man who picked up her trunk was not undermining her strength but standing alongside it, and that the difference between those two things was everything. She had found that difference on a rainy morning on a train platform, and she had spent 11 years living inside it, and she intended, she thought, to spend a great many more. Reuben squeezed her hand. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the wagon and the shop and the road back to the house and the town spreading out around them in the morning light, and she thought about 4 children and a raised bed in the garden, and the sound of reading aloud and the dancing at the June social, and the gun coming down on a dusty street because she had looked a man in the eye and told the truth, and that had been enough. And she thought about all of it, and about what it added up to, which was a life, specifically and completely hers, built alongside someone who was specifically and completely himself, and the adding up was not diminishment but increase, the sum larger than its parts, which was what the good things always are. "Ready?" she said. And they walked off the platform together into the warm May morning, into the years still ahead of them, into everything that was already and always just beginning.